On December 21, 2022, a U.S. Air Force RC-135 reconnaissance aircraft was on a reconnaissance mission over the South China Sea when a Chinese Navy J-11 approached the RC-135, with the two aircraft less than 20 feet apart. Both the U.S. Pentagon and the Chinese military released videos taken from the perspective of their respective aircraft. The U.S. military claimed that the unprofessional and dangerous behavior of the Chinese naval aircraft posed a potential risk to the area, and the Chinese military did not respond to the U.S. military's accusations. But the event was reminiscent of a collision between Chinese and U.S. military aircraft over the same area on April 1, 2001, which the Chinese called the 81192 incident, the number of a Chinese fighter jet. The Americans called the collision the Hainan Island incident. The South China Sea region, after World War II, became a very controversial and risky area. The ROC government claimed sovereignty over most of the South China Sea and many of its islands, and the Chinese drew territorial boundaries that extended into the waters of Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. As a result, disputes arose between China and the above-mentioned countries over where these areas belonged. When the Communist Party of China defeated the ROC government in 1949 and became the new ruler of China, it inherited the old government's territorial claims to these waters. For this reason, Chinese Communist forces also engaged in several armed conflicts with Vietnamese forces, including South Vietnam and later Communist Vietnam, in the South China Sea. This area of the South China Sea is very important for the international shipping trade in East Asia. China, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, the most important economies in Asia, must transport the oil they buy from the Middle East through this area. Whoever controls the waters of the South China Sea can control the major economies of Asia. The South China Sea has even more profound strategic significance for China. The most important base for the Chinese Navy's nuclear submarine fleet is located on China's Hainan Island. Chinese ballistic missile submarines, carrying nuclear warheads, use the deep enough waters of the South China Sea to operate, and from there, to the Pacific and Indian Oceans. If the South China Sea is controlled by another country, then China's strategic nuclear strike force will be greatly limited. So, this is one of the main reasons why China is trying its best to seize control of the South China Sea as well. Because the South China Sea is so important, the U.S. conducted strategic reconnaissance of the area early on. The main target of the reconnaissance is China's Hainan Island. On this largest Chinese island, in addition to having a Chinese nuclear submarine base, the Chinese Navy and Air Force have built a large number of airfields and deployed jet fighters and strategic bombers. It also has the most important electronic warfare base and a long-range radar base. Generally, although Chinese naval fighter jets will take off to intercept U.S. reconnaissance aircraft, as long as U.S. aircraft do not approach Hainan Island, Chinese fighter jets will not make aggressive moves against U.S. aircraft. U.S. reconnaissance aircraft also follow a fixed route, relying on powerful and advanced equipment to obtain information about the Chinese military, to avoid too close to Hainan Island, causing unnecessary trouble. But recently, the U.S. crews found that Chinese fighter jets were becoming more and more aggressive. They repeatedly flew over the U.S. reconnaissance aircraft at high speed, sometimes from below, very close. Sometimes the Chinese fighter jets would suddenly cut into the U.S. aircraft route, flying very close to the front. One of the most impressive to the U.S. crews was a pilot named Wei Wang, who repeatedly closed in the U.S. reconnaissance aircraft by a few feet, and once Wei Wang even held up a piece of paper with his email address. Inside the cockpit, the U.S. crews could read the letters on the paper. On April 1, 2001, at 8:55 a.m., an EP-3E Ares reconnaissance aircraft, marked Buno 156511, assigned to Fleet Air Reconnaissance Squadron 1, took off from Kadena Air Base on Okinawa, Japan, for an electronic signals intelligence mission to the South China Sea. The aircraft had a total of 24 crew members. The Ares flew along a route that has been used by the U.S. military for many years, flying at an altitude of 22,000 feet and a speed of 180 knots. After more than 5 hours of flight, 2 Chinese Navy J-8Bs came into view of the U.S. pilots, about 70 miles from Hainan Island. The 2 fighters came from Lingshui airfield on Hainan Island. One of the fighters, number 81192, was flown by none other than Commander Wei Wang. The fighter piloted by Wei Wang rapidly approached the EP-3, with his J-8B closest to the EP-3 being only 5 feet away. Wang waved his arm at the American pilot from the cockpit, seemingly to get the American aircraft to leave. After approaching and flying away from the U.S. aircraft twice in a row, Wang approached from the left rear of the EP-3 for the 3rd time. The Chinese fighter then hit the propeller of the EP-3's number 1 engine. The J-8B broke into 2 pieces and immediately crashed, and pilot Wang was seen ejecting from the cabin. The U.S. EP-3's number 1 engine was damaged and not working, and the left flap was hit and also lost control. The radome on the nose was hit by debris from the J-8B and fell off. The U.S. and China have given different accounts of the cause of the collision. The Chinese claimed that the Chinese fighter and the U.S. plane were flying parallel to each other, and the U.S. plane suddenly changed direction to approach the Chinese fighter, causing the 2 planes to collide. The U.S. version is that the Chinese fighter was approaching the U.S. plane from the left rear for the 3rd time, when it was going too fast and hit the propeller of the EP-3. There was no change in altitude, direction, or speed of the U.S. aircraft before the impact occurred. The EP-3 reconnaissance aircraft is a modified version of the Lockheed-designed and produced P-3 Orion aircraft, 116 feet long with a 99-foot wingspan, and has 4 turboprop engines, making it very suitable for low-speed flight. The Chinese Navy's J-8B, a high-speed interceptor, developed by China itself, was originally developed from the Soviet MiG-21, but was very much improved. With a length of 70 feet and a wingspan of 30 feet, with a good high-speed performance at high altitude, but poor low-speed and low-altitude performance. Immediately after the collision, another Chinese fighter reportedly contacted headquarters to report the collision and asked if it could fire on the U.S. aircraft, but was overruled. The Chinese commander ordered this aircraft to follow the parachuting Wei Wang, observe where he fell into the water, and report the location, so that the Chinese Navy could conduct a search and rescue. This Chinese fighter then circled in place to confirm Wang's parachute location. Soon after, the Chinese Navy launched a massive search and rescue operation, but never found Commander Wang. There are different accounts for this. One account is that Wang died soon after the collision and his body sank into the sea, while another account is somewhat of a conspiracy theory. The Chinese Navy quickly rescued Wang, but to gain the initiative in diplomacy, Chinese officials falsely claimed that Wang was missing. And a few years later, someone claimed online that Wang had been seen somewhere, that he had changed his identity, and that he had received a promotion. And in EP-3, U.S. pilot Osborne found he lost control of the aircraft, and it began to roll, climbing to 30,000 feet and then dropping sharply to 14,000 feet. Osborne informed his crews to prepare for a jump, but eventually, he regained control of the injured aircraft. Osborne then decided to make a forced landing on the water, but he quickly changed his mind, because the plane was overweight and the flaps had failed, and he would likely cause the plane to disintegrate if he made a forced landing on the water. So Osborne decided to find the nearest land airport to land. And the nearest airport, which was 70 miles away, was the Lingshui military airport on Hainan Island. Osborne felt he had no choice, because he did not know how long the aircraft could work. After deciding to land at Lingshui Airport, the crews on board the EP-3 immediately began emergency destruction processes. Unfortunately, however, no one on the aircraft was well trained in emergency destruction, and they lacked the tools to do so. For example, for some of the military laptops, the U.S. crews simply dropped them on the floor and jumped on them to try to destroy them, but the Chinese could still easily recover the data inside. For the advanced reconnaissance equipment on the EP-3, the team members used fire axe to destroy the display terminals and input devices, but the most critical signal collection sensors and central processor remained intact. They would soon fall into the hands of the Chinese. Although the team tossed some classified information and laptops overboard, a significant amount of information was still left on the aircraft, particularly an overlooked tape, recording the U.S. Navy's tracking and decoding of Chinese nuclear submarine communications. That would reveal the extent of American means of collection and knowledge of Chinese strategic nuclear strike forces. Although the panicked U.S. crews left behind a large amount of classified information and equipment to the Chinese, afterward Pentagon investigators inquired and concluded that the intelligence leak did not cause core and irreparable damage to the United States, and that the risks and losses were manageable. While flying to Lingshui Airport, Osborne, the pilot of the EP-3, and his companion, sent a distress call to the Chinese military via the International Distress Channel, but never received a response from the Chinese, which could have resulted in the slow and conspicuous aircraft being marked as a threatening target by Chinese air defense systems, and thus shot down by them. Fortunately, Osborne still managed to land the plane on the runway of Lingshui Airport. A plausible explanation is that the Chinese knew the Americans were coming. They acquiesced to the emergency landing, and the later Chinese actions showed they were prepared for the Americans' arrival. And the Chinese did not respond to the American pilot's call for help, to make things look like the American plane landed at the Chinese airport without permission, so that they could gain the initiative in diplomacy. As soon as the EP-3 landed, Chinese Marines surrounded the aircraft and blocked the U.S. aircraft at the end of the runway with military trucks. The U.S. crew sent one last message to the Pacific Reconnaissance Operations Center that they had landed safely, then zeroed in on the radio's encryption equipment. The Americans left the plane at gunpoint from the Chinese soldiers. Chinese soldiers quickly transported the Americans to a military camp, where Chinese intelligence officers took over the Americans and began interrogating the crews. Despite the Americans' protests, Chinese intelligence officials threatened the Americans that, if they refused to answer questions, they would never be allowed back into the United States. The American crews were forced to submit to interrogation, but they answered only the most basic questions, and did not reveal any U.S. military information. Overall, the Americans were treated well. They were given cigarettes and good food. At first, the Americans complained that the Chinese food was not to their liking. The Chinese soon provided food to the EP-3 crews that were to American taste. The Chinese also gave the Americans some poker cards and English newspapers to kill time. The guards were also friendly, and one guard even talked to the Americans about the band Eagles. As soon as the EP-3 group was detained, 3 U.S. diplomats in China were sent to Hainan Island to meet with the U.S. crews. However, it was not until the third day that they were able to meet with the crews. The incident eventually led to a diplomatic crisis, with the Chinese insisting that the American was fully responsible and demanding an apology and compensation, while the American argued that they had done nothing wrong, refused to apologize or compensate, and demanded that the Chinese immediately release the detained EP-3 crews and return the American reconnaissance aircraft. The matter eventually affected the highest levels of both sides, with Chinese Chairman Jiang Zemin claiming that, on the streets of the United States, if two people collide, they have to say sorry, and that the Americans now refuse to apologize, which is unconscionable. In turn, U.S. President George W. Bush issued a statement indicating that the U.S. was unlikely to stop its reconnaissance operations to China, and would not apologize for an accident it did not cause. The two sides entered a stalemate. Senior diplomats on both sides were in constant contact, trying to reach a mutually acceptable formula. Eventually, U.S. Secretary of State Colin Luther Powell wrote a personal letter to Chinese Vice Premier Qian Qichen, expressing sorry that the collision had occurred, and subsequently, on April 5, a 5-point formula was agreed upon, in which the U.S. ambassador would send a public, official letter to the Chinese foreign minister, expressing very sorry for the disappearance of the Chinese pilot, and the entry of the U.S. plane into Chinese territory and landing did not have verbal clearance, while the Chinese arranged for the release of the U.S. crews. In these diplomatic letters, in vague and highly diplomatic terms, the Americans interpreted them as expressing sorry about the loss of personnel and the accident, while the Chinese interpreted them as the Americans apologizing for their mistake. So both sides saved face, and the incident was resolved. On April 12, after the U.S. ambassador to China presented the Chinese foreign minister with an official letter, agreed upon by both sides, the 24 U.S. crews were released, and they were flown on a U.S. military plane to Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii. As for the EP-3 that was at Lingshui Airport, Lockheed said they could send engineers to fix it within a few months, so it could fly back to the U.S. base on its own. But the Chinese refused the request, arguing that it would be an insult to the Chinese government to let the illegally entered military aircraft fly out of China on its own. So after negotiations, the Americans leased 2 Russian An-124s, dismantled the EP-3, and loaded it onto those Russian transport planes to leave China. American government paid $34,567 for the duration of the EP-3 crew's stay in China, but the American rejected the Chinese demand for $1 million in compensation for the crashed fighter and the missing pilot. This ended the Hainan Island incident. But the confrontation between the two countries in the South China Sea did not end there. As the U.S. military resumed reconnaissance flights to the South China Sea and Hainan Island on May 29, 2001. In August 2014, and again in May 2016, Chinese naval pilots flying more advanced J-11 fighters intercepted U.S. reconnaissance aircraft at close range twice. This interception on December 21, 2022, was certainly not the last dangerous action either. With these dangerous moves, the Chinese hoped to force the Americans to reduce their reconnaissance operations in the South China Sea and Hainan Island. The Chinese once complained to the Americans that they must not feel good if China sends reconnaissance planes on reconnaissance missions off the California coast. It may sound like there is some truth to this complaint, but the United States, as well as becoming a Roman-style global empire that controls order around the world, is inevitably going to weaken and control regional powers around the world. Even China itself, as a regional power in East Asia, does not care about the complaints of its weaker neighbors in the South China Sea, when they draw territorial lines near the coastlines of their neighbors, and when they turn the islands they control that are disputed by sovereignty into the fortress. In 2001, China and the United States were two countries that needed each other. China was preparing to officially join the WTO, and needed the support of the United States and the Western world to prepare its economy for takeoff, while the United States needed to take advantage of China's large and cheap human resources and an environment that could pollute at will to work for the United States' globalized economic strategy. Now, China has grown and becomes the second largest economy. Chinese leaders believe that China is strong enough and does not want to be a slave of the US anymore. China wants to get its rightful place and become a player with equal status with the US. And the Chinese believe that the Americans will never let China become an equal player. The US will only restrict and suppress China. So a conflict between the US and China is inevitable. The Chinese do not seem to be wrong in thinking that the US is indeed tightening its restrictions on China and curbing China's expanding ambitions. As the Chinese turn the islands they control in the South China Sea into fortresses, and the US continues to strengthen its military presence in the region, then perhaps the next plane crash will turn into a war.